Let's get going. This is designing flexible cross-platform design systems. Just as a quick starting point, there are a lot of GIFs in this. Some of them are kind of flashy, so if you're sensitive at all to that, I apologize. Maybe take a step back and come back in a little while. I'll try and do better next time. With that out of the way, hello. You might be wondering who I am after that lovely introduction. I like to think of myself as this, some sort of fighting lobster. But I am a senior director of the UX platform team at GoDaddy. You can find me on the internet. So the phrase UX platform might make you do this, because I know it does when I talk to my peers and a lot of other people. It includes our design system, but it's a little more. I'm going to start with the design system, which we call the GoDaddy Experience System, but it's also all the things on top of that. So I like to say that it's all of our cross-cutting user experience technology. So it's just a little bit more than our design system. We do things like web app frameworks and native app frameworks. But let's talk about the design system. It's called UX Core 2. The internal version, I guess UX Core 1 is about 5 or 6 years old. It predates me. UX Core 2 is pretty robust. It's about 3 years old. I think actually next month it'll be 3 years old. It's got about 50 components, React-based. It also has, I would say about 20 components support React Native. But the thing I'm actually most proud about is that about 40% of all front-end engineers at GoDaddy have contributed to it. I'm actually not going to talk about that in this talk, but they gave a talk last year about sort of the inner source model that we use there. Another fun fact that isn't on this slide is that there's about 50 product teams that use this day in, day out. So we actually do have a pretty large number of consumers. Of course, at this point, I'm sure you're taking a bunch of notes, just like I've been. Let's dig in a little bit more. So the title of this talk was very intentional: delivering flexible cross-platform design systems. Each one of these things we're going to go through line by line, actually in reverse order. So let's talk about design systems. Now, a lot of people up here are going to be talking about more design stuff than I think I am, but I think of a design system as any sort of framework for understanding. And if you love this show the way I do, you know that there are some basic elements to anything. So let's break it down. How many people in this room have heard of atomic design? Yeah, everyone. That's sort of what I expected. So one of the metaphors that I really thought atomic design missed out on is there are all these subatomic particles, right? Muons and gluons and protons and quarks and those types of things. So a lot of the things that people call atoms, I like to think of as the subatomic bits of atomic design. So your color palette, your typography, your spacing, your voice. In technically speaking, atomic design refers to these as atoms, but they're more to it than that in my mind. And of course, the meat of any design system is rotating floating packages in space, or as we all like to think of them as components. Lots and lots of components. In the atomic design metaphor, of course, this is your atoms and molecules. We don't really have any quote-unquote organisms that are part of UX Core. We do maintain what you can think of as shared headers. The canonical example, if you use common software, is you go to Gmail, there's a header. You go to Drive, there's a header. Very common user interface metaphor that most companies have to deal with. So you've got the bits and pieces, the components, and of course, the documentation, which is really important to be living documentation. And not just living documentation for engineers, but living documentation for all disciplines. So you might have designers, you might have technical writers, you might have contributors. What does this mean in this particular design system? I'm sure there are others out there. But just consider something as simple as a button, right? And just like every other design system, there's lots of types of buttons. They are React components. And this is the engineering page. But designers don't care about any of this. They don't need to see 8 buttons next to each other. They want to know when to use a button and why. And that documentation is probably more important, or equally as important, to the developer documentation. Beyond that, there's a bunch of workflows that you need to think about. How am I going to change a component? How are people going to edit the docs? How am I going to version this thing? And that all boils down to some very boring documentation that you have to write. And it is for the governance of your system extensibility. So, oh, you found something that you want to contribute, but how do you socialize that? How do you decide what goes in the system, what doesn't? In particular, one of the mantras I like to have is the system comes first. Consistency is more important than some team's sort of special snowflake feature that they want. So again, you've sure probably seen a lot of this today, and you'll see a lot more of it. I just wanted to talk about that problem space for a minute. So let's talk about cross-platform. And of course, the internet is this amazing thing that kind of looks like this. I found this GIF. I was just so amazed by it. I needed to use it. Behold the inner tubes. But underneath the covers, what are we talking about? We're talking about the web, of course, and then, of course, mobile web, because that is a very different profile, right? You might be dealing with 3G connections. You might be dealing with different device sizes. And then there's, on top of that, native mobile apps, if you're targeting those things with your design system. And I'm, of course, leaving out some of the more traditional media like print and video. So basics here, if you think about web and mobile web as different platforms, which I do, you've got this very basic assumption of responsive design, right? This is old stuff. I mean, it is old stuff, right? Like I didn't miss anything, right? Your silence, you're laying me out here if I didn't. We don't call it responsive design anymore, just let me know. And like most design systems, we use React. It has won the framework wars. Does anyone remember the framework wars? They were from about 2012 to 2015. Yeah, there was a lot of worry there that there would continue, and it didn't. React won. And now there's this thing that's sort of come along that's sort of not that mature. It's pretty mature. It's React Native. It's getting there. I think a lot of the threading model changes that Facebook are working on are great. And if you've worked with React Native at all, anybody? Less people than I expected. You'll know that when you have to deal with styles between React and React Native, you start to make this face. Because do you use CSS? Do you use inline styles? Your design system might need both, right? Like, for example, the design system, UX Core 2, ships a number of utility classes that are used on things like marketing pages that are managed by a CMS, those folks don't know JavaScript. They're not writing React components. They're writing old school HTML and CSS just to throw up on some page. So there's no straightforward answer to this, but I can say that I'm pretty confident CSS blocks is moving in the right direction. I haven't had the opportunity to actually rewrite some of our components with it, but I did have a chance to sit down with Adam Miller, who's the author of CSS blocks at LinkedIn, or one of the authors, and what they're doing with rewriters is the way to do it. You could use CSS in a browser, and then you could write a rewriter that does it to inline styles and actually compile that with a very small runtime instead of like styled components as a relatively large runtime, for example. So technical bits of styles, but there are also design concerns of being cross-platform. Do you mimic things, right? Are you going to mimic the behaviors of native mobile religiously? Maybe not. But also, maybe. It really depends. Your mileage may vary. I'm going to show one particular example from our design system about drop-downs. Our drop-down is relatively feature-rich. On the left-hand side is mobile web, simulating it with DevTools, and on the right is the iOS simulator. So you can see one of the things we realized because of overflow was, hey, we actually should have a pop-up menu there. Like that's actually makes some sense. And the interesting thing about this is that we had implemented this behavior first on iOS and Android actually. And then we backported it to the web because it was just better. But you'll notice that if you're rigidly following the iOS guidelines, like this looks nothing like what you'll see in either nothing like you'll see in Android, but it is this sort of mix between the two. We've gotten really good feedback about it. It's easy to maintain, easy to deal with, but it requires some creative thinking. And there is no cut and dry rule with this stuff. You got to use this thing quite a bit. That's why we all get paid, right? That's what I like to remind folks. It's like, think about it. It's not supposed to be easy. But there's a mantra that I particularly like that I picked up years and years ago in university from a paper, and it's intuitive equals familiar. It's by a guy named Jeff Raskin in '94. You can Google this. There's a really great paper on it. It sort of just proves it matter of fact. Like, yes, all the things that you call intuitive by definition are the things that you're familiar with. And it's about identifying the segments of folks that you're targeting and what they know to prove what is intuitive to them. So that's what it means to be cross-platform. What does it mean to be flexible? We already established that we have to have responsive design. That's flex, boxable. But there are other types of flexibility, not just in what it means to be cross-platform, but in the things that you expose to your users. So the left side here is that same demo from before, but the right side is actually that feature turned off. So we had requests from folks like, don't enable this out all the time. There are places where I want to use this. It doesn't work on a mobile viewport, of course, but if it's up to the product team to turn that on or off, depending on the viewport, because they know the viewport, right? We're just the design system. They're the product code. You should never end up in this state, right? But this documentation site is purposefully enables all the features. If I saw this on GoDaddy in production, I'd say, hey, you should probably turn that, full screen off when you're in mobile web. But, how many is too many? I can't tell you. But it is a lot, and people ask for a lot of features, which is why you've got to remind yourself that the system comes first. Next up, of course, is, coloring. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So we have a number of palettes. This is the dark one. This is Media Temple, where we also own Media Temple. Anybody from Germany might recognize these colors if you use Domain Factory. We actually have about 197 of these. So the important thing to recognize when you're building a flexible design system is, are you one brand or are you many brands? Because there are a lot of implications for that. In particular, if you studied computer science, maybe not everybody did, but there's this thing that CS theory covers called lambda calculus, and it's surprisingly applicable to some of these bound color questions. So going back to our button, the code sort of looks like this. You've got some Sass on the left there that represents the palettes, and then you've got some React on the right that represents the actual design name, right? And you can see there's a mapping between the design property and what's in the Sass code. And that works all well and good, but what if a brand decides that they want to use their secondary palette color for their primary button? You have to then introduce another set of variables for all of those buttons. Seems pretty obvious. We all get it. We all get it because we all get lambda calculus as sort of an intuitive thing. This is an alpha conversion in lambda calculus. So when people say CSS is Turing complete, this is some of the stuff they're talking about. So now to the meat of this talk with about half left. Let's talk about delivering. And of course, this is the one that we probably know the most about because, as I said, we delivered about 50 product teams. We have to be highly available, right? We can't let anything happen when we're hit by that bus. So let's talk a little bit about the stages of delivery. Who runs a design system in production? Okay, so for everyone else, you're probably going to start having this face because there's a lot going on here. You have to develop and publish and promote and roll it out and maintain it. We're going to walk through these one by one. So development, of course, kind of looks like this. And the important thing to remember is that workflow is king, right? So easiest thing to do, the fastest thing to do, most workflows will tend towards that. If it's fast, if it's easy. But there's one that a lot of folks don't think about, which is when all the Power Rangers get together and form whatever the Mega Power Ranger thing is called. And that only happens at scale when you make it easy for new contributors. And again, this isn't a talk about process and how to gain contributors, but think about how easy it is, talk to your contributors, take that feedback into account. An easy mantra I like is sort of this in a nutshell, right? What is the any key? How would you know that if you'd never used a computer before and you were Homer Simpson, you weighed 300 pounds? But if you treat every entry point as though it could be a first interaction, things work, right? People just get it. So when you see a lot of empty readmes, this is a classic problem. Of course, as a longtime Node person, I am of the philosophy that in most cases, this being the exception, the smaller thing is more easily understood. And these days, there's a lot of pieces that could be near each other. And if you imagine you're assembling this particular spaceship, and all of those pieces are individual Git repositories, that's going to be a little bit of time. And so there's been a trend towards this thing called a monorepo, which is fine, but it requires a fair amount of diligence. So the canonical classic example I see in a lot of monorepos, which is frankly inexcusable to me, is two things. One, all of your packages still need readmes. You can't just get rid of them or point them somewhere, because when people run one of the most core workflow commands, which is npm home, so if you type npm home any package, it goes to the homepage property of that package. In the absence of a homepage property, it goes to npmjs.org/package/the package name. And so if there's nothing there, and you didn't include like a repository name, there's absolutely no way to figure out where that thing lives. And the Google search results are even worse because it's not the name of a GitHub repo. It's like buried in a packages folder. So it's really, really important that you do those two things if you use a monorepo. So that out of the way. The other big workflow thing is previewing your stories. And we actually had written a tool about 2 years ago, before Storybook had gotten a lot of its investment. We recently transitioned everything over, and you should just use it. I mean, I'm sure there are other tools out there, and we're at a design systems conference, so if you're making something that's like Storybook but better, more power to you. But as somebody who just has to make a bunch of components, like, I'm seriously impressed with it. Like, there was no React Native support 2 years ago, all of the add-ons, all the things that it does, it's quite impressive. But there's one thing in particular that it doesn't have, and that is some way to actually structure examples. So I'm going to talk about that for a second. So this is from the Storybook docs, right? Write a story, include it inline. The problem with this is that it's not a great set of examples, right? Because everything is bound to something that's related to Storybook, and they're all in the same file. Like, imagine this with 25 plus examples. You'd start to feel like this, probably. So what's a better approach? Again, this is also from the Storybook docs, which gets you pretty close. And a good example, for example, is something like this. So you'll notice that I didn't include a relative path to the repo. I included an absolute package name. This is copy-paste code. You can put it in your production app. It will work, period. That's my litmus test for what a good example is. You copy it, you put it in your app, you didn't change anything, it works. And you can do a lot of those things with a little bit of Webpack magic, Webpack aliasing. So I like to think of it as simple as possible with the following set of features. Clear import or require usage. You can structure platform-specific examples. You can include design documentation alongside the component. And it should be pretty close to zero config if you follow some convention. And so we had something that was the old tool used, and we migrated it over to Storybook. And it looks something like this. So indexes for your various entry points. Anything else is assumed to be an example that runs on web and native. If you have any web or native specific things, those are fine, because those do exist. You could put them there. There are also things like, if you use, who uses React DocGen? Anybody? You should use React DocGen to generate prop types documentation. And then, of course, where your design documentation lives, like what your designers should be writing, which is probably going to be MDX. We're still sort of working on that. And then environment is how you do that magic mapping. So like, how did I have that bare non-relative path? It's through some magic there. And then, of course, if you include any, SAS, because you don't want to or less or whatever. And then you can just use these things really easily with Storybook. So the exemplar scope is what we're working on. It's not quite there yet. Check back in a few weeks. But the idea is that if you follow that file structure, you can just use that config file, right? It's basically a shareable Storybook config that follows a very sane set of defaults. So I am getting pretty close over, so we're going to pick up the speed. Publishing. All right. Production begins at publish time, which means all your hopes and dreams will be crushed. But seriously, publishing can break these things. It's a lot. So what's an average package JSON in a cross-platform app look like? It looks like this. You can break things by not including React Native. You can break things by not transpiling. There's quite a bit there. Of course, you want to promote things. Continuous deployment with a design system is very challenging because there's all these people out there that are using your app, and there are just too many unknowns. They could be overwriting classes, they could be overwriting JavaScript, and it's just not happening for us at a large enough scale. I hope that folks are. We're getting close to it, but it requires a level of testing that is just kind of beyond. So we're at our last step here. Bear with me. I think I'm going to be 2 or 3 minutes over. So let's roll out to production, right? What is this last production step? Of course, anything that is production-based should probably not include your bundle, right? You have 50 apps. You can't have them bundling all of their Webpack things in. You need to expose a vendor bundle up out there. And of course, beyond that, there should only ever really be one true version of your design system in production. And what do I mean by that? I mean expose Webpack externals so that people aren't using them themselves. You can't have 50 product teams bundling the same 40K and showing it to your customers twice. You need to have them externalize that and then use a version of those externals. And now we're getting to the point where you're probably all sort of looking like this, because this is how I feel whenever I have to deal with Webpack. And this is where it gets a little heady if you've never had to deal with a Webpack bundle. But a Webpack bundle is basically a module loader and a set of modules. And all those modules just represent the actual code that you're running. Externalization just says instead of bundling the code Webpack, just go ahead and point to some window, something that's already exposed on the window because your script has set it. So you expose these things in your shared module config, and then all your consumers use it. It's that easy. It's just a pattern that has worked exceptionally well for us. You can roll out new versions, you can put things inside of it. Lastly, going to be about 4 minutes total over. So now you've got these things, you've got these 50 product teams using it. How do you actually distribute these assets to them in a consistent way? The canonical example I like to give is you've discovered there's a bug in your form element, and you need to roll out a fix. How do you get it to all 50 of those teams at the same time without them doing anything? It's a good question. So first of all, you're going to npm publish your package somewhere. And then on the other side of it, there's a whole bunch of servers, and those are all your consumers. And normally, people would just put a static file in their web server, and then they'd have a static script and link tag. And you got to flip that on its head. If you publish it to some sort of intermediate server, say config holder for lack of a better word, then all of those other servers just make a call to that every 15 minutes. Like, hey, by the way, what's the new version of the design system? Great, I'll take those script and link tags and put them in my app. We use a system called Warehouse. You can use it if you want to. Lastly, let's talk about maintenance, which is fixing fires before they happen. And if you've never been in a fire, it sort of comes at you like this. You think everything's fine, oh, there's a little more traffic, and then, oh my God, everything's ridiculous. So this is what we say when we say DevOps, when things really don't go as planned. Using the pattern that I had explained before, you really want to have a copy of everything on disk. So when all those servers make a request to you, they should be saving that to a file system, which is what we would call failover caching. Secondly, when things go wrong, you simply can't do this, right? You can't just roll up, paste over the problem. You need to have a rollback plan, right? Roll back to the previous version of the config, et cetera. For us, this is very easy. It's what Warehouse does. It's one of the main features that it has. You just distag the old version, and boom, it works. So if you want to run that yourself, you can. And then the other bit of maintenance is about, keeping your car clean, hygiene. paying technical debt. And when most people hear about technical debt, they just simply think, no. But you can't avoid it. If you don't fix it, it will crush your app. It will crush your design system. It will crush anything if you don't pay your technical debt. That's why I use the Tyrion Lannister GIF, because you should always pay your technical debt. And if you're wondering what I mean by technical debt, like if I say technical debt and you're just totally gone, there's some real basics here. Upgrading to new versions of React, Babel, and Webpack. Babel 7, anybody? Anybody upgrading to Babel 7? It's non-trivial. Removing deprecated APIs, so if you have any component will update, component will receive props, and using the latest APIs. So portals, React 16 context, any of those. It adds up pretty quickly. But if you can conquer all that, you might just have a production-ready design system, and that is the end.